hot days in the July of 1863, 3 days that helped shape the entire course of the history of the United States. One small, previously unknown town that would one day become one of the most famous towns in all of the country. Of course, I am talking about the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, the bloodiest battle in American history and the bloodiest ever fought on American territory. Fought in a crucial moment in American history, this battle would either sway the war in the favor of the Confederacy or the Union. Alright, enough dramatics. So now I'm just going to spit some information at you and hope some of it sticks with you. This battle was one of the most important in American history, and if it wouldn't have gone the way that it did, we may not have the United States as we see it today. So, anyways, I'm Cameron as always, and let's get into it. Now, first of all, it's important to know where the war was at by this point. Now, after yeeting themselves out of the Union in 1861, the Confederate States had been fighting a war with less soldiers, less supplies, and less economic backing than the Union, and had been doing it overall pretty well. They had great victories early on, such as those at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. At the same time, the Union had been having many difficulties internally, what with their army generals, and trying to keep what was left of the Union together while fighting the South. The South, throughout the whole war up to this point, had been trying desperately to get the support of the European countries. If these European countries accepted and acknowledged the succession of the southern states, this could be a huge benefit to the South and could tip the scales in their favor. Thus, it was essential for the South's effort to not only get recognition from Europe, but also financial and trade support. So here we are, smack in the middle of the American Civil War. The North, at this point, is slowly failing and facing an invading Southern army in their own territory of Pennsylvania. The South now on the cusp of giving the crucial support from Europe that they need, that could probably completely turn the war in their favor. And all of this would come to a head in the beginning of July of 1863. So what made this battle happen? How did these two great armies end up in a little-known town in Pennsylvania? Well, as I mentioned before, this all started with Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania in June of 1863. Now, this was hot off the back of a Confederate victory at Chancellorsville, and the North at this moment was not really doing too hot. Morale was low, there was a lot of negative sentiments towards the war, and the Southern morale was as high as it had ever been. With this invasion, Lee thought he could gain more victories and possibly finally be able to convince the European nations to recognize and support the Confederate cause. Now, Lee's invading army numbered around 71,000, and he would divide them into 3 corps for the invasion. There was also cavalry led by General Jeb Stuart, which is important to keep in mind. Why, you ask? Well, the cavalry were basically the eyes of General Lee's invading army due to their quick mobility, and Jeb decided to take his forces on a sweep around the Army of the Potomac, which is the Union Army, during the last week of June, thus removing the eyes of General Lee. Now, at this time, the Army of the Potomac, or as I mentioned just earlier, the Union forces, were stationed in Frederick, Maryland, under the new leadership of General Meade. Now, Frederick was essentially due south of Gettysburg. Now, General Lee's spies informed him of this, and he maneuvered his troops to be prepared to meet this threat from the south. Meanwhile, General Meade has his forces begin to move north to meet the Confederate army, all whilst ensuring that the Army of the Potomac kept between the Confederates and the Union capital of Washington, D.C. Now, the forward elements of Meade's forces briefly clashed with Confederate forces near Gettysburg before pulling back to defend the town, as they realized that it would be a vital crossroads in the battles to come. So they dug in and waited for reinforcements, and thus came July 1st, the first day of the battle. The Union troops in Gettysburg were attacked by the Confederate forces in the morning from the north and held their positions until reinforcements began to arrive later in the morning. By early afternoon, the Union forces had secured Seminary Ridge, which covered the northwest and western parts of the town. They had also secured the northern approaches to the town and had troops positioned on Cemetery Hill, which lied behind the town. However, these positions would not last long, as Confederates began to launch their second attack of the day in the afternoon against all of the parts of the Union line, which held until an attack on the weaker northeastern flank led to the collapse of the forces guarding the northern approaches. This then led to a full retreat of the Union forces through the streets of the town while fierce fighting took place. They eventually regrouped on Cemetery Hill, and the two Union corps that had been part of the defense ended up with around 50% casualties total. And this was a huge loss and a horrible start to the critical battle. By the end of the day, Union General Meade had arrived to the field, and he determined that this would be where the crucial battle would need to be fought. General Lee of the Confederacy, meanwhile, was contemplating an attack on Cemetery Hill, as I mentioned earlier, the position behind the town where the Union had withdrawn to. However, this attack did not materialize that day. Now, this assault could have been decisive and possibly put a swift end to the battle and possibly the war. However, it did not happen. And so, the first day came to an end, with the combined casualties of both sides being around 15,000 men. Now, at the beginning of the second day of battle, July 2nd, the Union forces had lines along Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, which made a fish hook shape. During the morning, Lee had arguments with his commanders about where to make an attack for the day, with some saying they should wait for the Union and Meade to strike first. In the end, their attacks were focused on the southern part of the Union line, with other attacks in the north along Cemetery Hill. These attack plans were based on Lee's intelligence that the southern flank was weaker than it actually was. Now, this southern attack was surprised to find that the Union line was directly in their path, as the Union commander had, that morning against orders, moved his line to a hill along Emmitsburg Road so as to get his artillery better firing positions. Now, after Meade learned of this, he was furious and attempted to send reinforcements into this new weak spot on the line. The Confederate attack, however, ended up shattering his new line and driving it back. Now, the southernmost point of the Union line was Little Round Top, which was held by a meager force of Union troops, who at this point had become essentially isolated. Now, these troops held off multiple Confederate attacks on this crucial point in the line. Now, in a last-ditch effort to push the Confederates back, they launched a bayonet charge down the hill into the advancing Confederate lines, which shockingly worked and became one of the most well-known feats of the battle. Now, this was crucial, and in the end, the southern attacks by the Confederates did not end up succeeding as much as they wanted, and the Union line held. Now, the Confederate attacks on the right side of the Union line on the second day of the battle didn't really amount to much, due to troops arriving late to the battlefield and confusion with orders among the commanders. And so the second day ended with the Union still clinging to their left flank after a close brush with disaster, and the Confederate forces still at strength. The combined casualty numbers of both sides for the second day were an estimated 20,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing in action. Now begins the third day and final day of the battle, the crucial day. Now, the Union lines were still holding their defensive positions of Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, with the southernmost point being the Little Round Tops. Now, General Lee, on the third day, wanted to make similar attacks of those he made the day previously. However, some shifting Union movements along their lines made him change his mind. What ended up happening was him constructing a plan to position 12,500 of his men to attack the left center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge, after a considerably large Confederate artillery barrage. Now, Lee's generals protested this plan, as their troops would have to march around 3/4 of a mile across an open field towards the Union lines. These protests, however, had little effect, and the attack still took place. The pre-attack bombardment included hundreds of guns from the Confederates and the Union, who began to fire back, and it was the biggest artillery bombardment of the entire war. Sadly, it would have little effect on the Union lines, and around 3 p.m., the 12,500 Confederate soldiers stepped out of the tree line and began their 3/4 mile march towards Cemetery Ridge in what would become known as Pickett's Charge. Now, these soldiers faced intense fire from Union artillery on the Round Tops and Cemetery Ridge, combined with the small arms fire of all the Union soldiers defending the ridge. It was a massacre. Only a small amount of Confederate soldiers even made it to the Union lines at a stone fence known as the Angle, but even they too were defeated in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, what remained of the battered Confederate forces made a retreat back to their lines. Only half of them made it back, half out of 12,500 men. The rest of the soldiers lay dead or dying on the battlefield. Now, as they stumbled back to their lines, it is said that General Lee himself was there to greet them, apologizing for his failure. Now, I think it's needless to say that at this point, the battle was essentially lost for the Confederates. The 4th of July, the next day, was spent with both armies collecting their dead and wounded, and the Confederate army would then proceed to withdraw and retreat. The battle was over, and a crucial victory was won at the exact right moment for the preservation of the Union. Now, it wasn't really until after the war that further analysis came to the conclusion that the Battle of Gettysburg was a crucial turning point in the war. The Confederate army would now go on the retreat, and the North gained the victory that they desperately needed to boost morale. Combined with the next day's Union victory at Vicksburg, the tide of the whole war had successfully been turned. The Confederates would never again be able to launch such a daring invasion of the North. They had also effectively lost their chances of gaining foreign support from Europe. The Southern morale that had been so high up to this point, and was possibly their greatest asset during the whole war, took a major blow. Now, there was no doubt the battle was crucial, and had it gone the other way, we may not see the United States as they are today. The battle was not just one of strategic victory or devastating loss, however. Many men gave up their lives fighting for what they believed in. Combined, there were approximately 50,000 casualties, with about 7,000 of those being killed. Now picture this. 7,000 dead, 7,000 families ruined for the preservation of the United States of America. And although time fades on, memory of the sacrifices made needs to be maintained so that we never go down that road again. The United States were built through communication and cooperation, and we can preserve it the same way. Alright, I hope you learned something today. If not, I hope you at least killed some boredom by hearing my sweet voice in your ears. Either way, I enjoyed making this one, and if you liked it, as always, you can leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more videos, and I will continue to try to spew historical and worldly information at you. Anyway, I've been Cameron, and as always, I'll see you on the flip side.